The 20th Century Limited is by many considered one of the most iconic trains of all time. It would have one of the most iconic locomotives and would write itself into the history books. My name is Jamie, and I welcome you to Great Passenger Trains. I will tell you all about its history while trying to showcase its power and prestige. So don't forget to subscribe as we explore electrification on the East Coast in next week's video, as we explore New Haven's electrification, showcasing its iconic EP5s and its second-hand ELCs. So don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out. The 20th Century Limited's first run would be on June 15, 1902. It would complete the trip from New York to Chicago within 20 hours, 4 hours quicker than the comparable Pennsylvania Railroad service. It would also feature a barber shop and secretary service on board the train. In June 1905, the trip would be cut down to 18 hours. However, there was an accident killing 21 people. The train would somehow run into a siding due to a switch that was changed from the main line to a freight siding. Due to the high speed of the train, it would overrun the siding. It would enter the freight siding at almost 70 miles per hour. The locomotive and 2 other cars would derail, and the wreckage of the 20th Century Limited would burn for more than 4 hours, and would only be extinguished after midnight. The investigation that took place would determine sabotage, as the main line signal would be indicated for the main line. However, the turnout itself would be set for the siding instead. There was no evidence that the train jumped the tracks. However, no party was ever found at fault, and there has been no official cause for the accident. The aftermath of the accident would be that the train would be reverted to its 20-hour timetable. In 1938, the 20th Century Limited would be refitted with more modern Pullman lightweight carriages. The interiors and streamlining would be designed by industrial designer Henry Dreyfuss. However, structurally they were identical to the Broadway Limited's Pullmans as well. However, these new streamlined train sets would be unveiled on 1938, June 15th. This new train set would leave at 6 o'clock and would arrive at 9 a.m. in Chicago. The livery would match the Hudsons at the time, with the main body being light grey with pinstriping in the middle. However, this would change with the 1948 train set, where they would be unveiled by General Eisenhower, where the new train set would match the paint scheme of the later E8 and E7s. The main locomotives that would play a part in the 20th Century Limited would be the Hudsons. Their story would begin in the 1920s. As trains got larger and heavier, the existing Pacifics on the New York Central were struggling. With the axle loads of the New York Central limiting larger Pacifics from ever being built, the Hudsons were born out of these requirements. These were a series of 464 locomotives with 3 different batches built from 1927 to 1938. Alco would produce its prototype, the 5200. This was a prototype Hudson and would be extensively tested around the New York Central's trackage. With the streamlining craze of the 1930s, streamlining would take place within the New York Central itself. The Hudsons would take center stage of the streamliners and etch themselves into history. The first of these streamlined Hudsons would be the last J1E Hudson, numbered 5344, fitted with a streamlined shroud designed by Carl F. Cantola. Number 5344 would be named Commodore Vander on December 27, 1934. Currently, there is a model of this streamlined Hudson in HO scale and is made by Broadway Limited. There were 2 more types of the streamlined Hudson. 10 Hudsons would be streamlined by Dreyfuss. The streamlining was designed by Henry Dreyfuss, hence the nickname the Dreyfuss Hudson. And there were 2 other Hudsons that were streamlined as well. These were streamlined for the Empire State Express and would be designed by Edward G. of the Budd Company. One thing that made the Hudsons relatively unique was the addition of a booster engine on the trailing truck. An issue with the Hudson's design was due to its 3 pairs of driving wheels. It would never improve on the tractive effort compared to Pacific locomotives and would struggle at low speed or starting trains. The booster would help when starting trains and at low speed. While they would serve their purpose, issues would arise with reliability and cost. These boosters would have normally 300 to 500 horsepower and would help with speeds from 10 miles to 35 miles per hour. These boosters would feature steam and exhaust pipes. One issue with boosters is that it doesn't function after 35 miles per hour, which is a problem, since the expectation of the Hudsons was to cruise at high speeds, which meant that a majority of the trip it would be simply dead weight. Another issue would be if the booster suffered an idler failure, it would cause the locomotive to be speed restricted, meaning for an express locomotive it would have to be taken out of service. From 1945 onwards, the EMD passenger diesel electrics, such as the E8s, E7s, would take over from older steam locomotives, such as the Hudsons. The main power of the New York passenger fleet would now be mainly E7s and E8s, but other locomotives such as Alco's PA would sometimes appear on the 20th century. However, the PAs would be more common on other trains such as in New England state. However, the EMD locomotives would number more than any other passenger diesel locomotive and would have a reputation for amazing reliability. However, as the railroads were struggling to afford to keep passenger trains, many would have a decline in quality. The New York Central's passenger trains would also follow suit. One of the additions to the 20th Century Limited in its last few years was a new type of sleeping car, called the Slumber Coach. The Slumber Coach would also be known as the Sleeper Coach in New York Central Service. The Slumber Coach was a way of upgrading accommodations for non-first-class passengers. The demand for private accommodation would remain in demand. However, other open-style coaches would fall in demand. The Slumber Coach was a good solution to this issue. It would feature 40 beds for the newly built and 36 beds for rebuilt coaches. The rooms on the Slumber Coach would feature a fold-away wash basin and a private toilet as well. These would feature more beds than any other previous types of sleepers. This meant that during Amtrak service, a Slumber Coach ticket would only cost $16.50 per night compared to $39.50 per night for a roomette in 1980. The New York Central would order 10 rebuilt from older Bud 22 roomette sleepers. On a normal train in the mid-60s, 2 Slumber Coaches would be fitted to each train. Something I do enjoy discussing on this channel, unsurprisingly, is food, especially discussing food that was made on these iconic trains. Today, I'll go through some of the examples of what you could have ordered on this train. As usual, I'll list both the breakfast and dinner menus in the descriptions below. So for your dinner service, some of the highlights you may receive would be a grilled red snapper with your usual vegetables and potatoes, or another choice would be beef ribs and beans and potatoes. Now, this menu from my understanding dates to after the war. However, I've not been able to attest to any certain date. Now, the menu choices are fairly consistent during the years with various types of meats and fish. For example, normally from what I have seen throughout the different types of menus is that you are always able to order fish, steak, some ribs, usually a ham choice, and something like chicken. Now, they're fairly consistent. Now, something other to understand is that the food choices are part of a set meal, and you'd be able to choose something from each section. One thing that does set it apart from the Pennsylvania Railroad offering, while minor, is the offering of a drink to go with the meal at no extra charge. The dessert section is nothing outrageous, however would feature things such as ice cream sundaes or a delicious pumpkin pie. The breakfast menu was no different in terms of offering, with typical assortments such as pancakes or French toast, while having such other options such as bacon and eggs. Something to consider is while the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central both did the same destination and return trip, the people they aimed at were very different people entirely. The 20th Century Limited was a premium train aimed at the new upstart and rich businessmen, while the Broadway Limited catered towards a much older crowd but quite a wealthy crowd. Now this showcased the very much differences in the interior, which could be considered retrofuturism or mid-century modern, compared to, let's say, on the Broadway Limited, which could be seen with more antique woods and all nicer furnishings, sort of like that. So you may ask, what was the legacy of the 20th Century Limited? Well, quite simply, it's extensive. While you may be unfamiliar with her work, Ayn Rand was a contemporary author whose most famous novel, Atlas Shrugged, would take influence from both the New York Central and the 20th Century Limited when writing her magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged. This book would feature a company named the 20th Century Motor Company, which is obviously inspired by the 20th Century Limited. Another famous passenger would be Robert Oppenheimer. He would be a famous passenger in the 20th century. On 15th October, Oppenheimer would be on the train to discuss a Manhattan Project with General Leslie Grove, James C. Marshall, and Kenneth Nichols. That meeting would be followed up with the decision to make Robert Oppenheimer the head of Los Alamos Laboratory, the birthplace of the atomic bomb. As with all great things, there is always an end, and that would be the same for the 20th Century Limited. December 2nd, 1967 would be its last trip, and somehow wouldn't be treated special. As usual, flowers and perfume would be given out to passengers, and it would depart track 34 at Grand Central. So what remains of this iconic train? Well, lucky for us, some of these carriages still survive. The observation and dining car is in operational use, and sometimes can be seen on special occasions, and a group is hoping to restore New York Central passenger cars for historical trips. The Fort Wayne Railroad has a plan, and the plan is to hopefully restore the Great Steel Fleet and to restore a Mohawk back into service. So if you do want to help contribute, I'll leave a link in the description for you to either volunteer or donate to the cause. A fair amount of the slumber coaches that existed on the New York Central also survived into preservation and can be seen on various tourist railroads. So what are my thoughts on the 20th century? It's quite simple. It's just iconic. As a fan of the New York Central, it has been my objective to model both the 1948 and 1938 train set. The Hudsons are simply iconic, and to me, personally, these are the trains that Superman Percy stopped on the cover art of a comic book. It is my great wish that the Hudsons and Nigers would have at least been preserved. If I have forgotten anything, do add it into the comments below. I love hearing back about the stories or even just the facts I've missed. Now, I do want to add something. Unfortunately, I can't add everything into a 15-minute video, so I may come back and redo this one and maybe do an extension. However, I just want to say thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you have enjoyed this video. Just want to say thank you to you, my viewer, and a thank you to my partner. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and have a good night.